Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here, first of all. I'll start with my introduction. I am Udit, a second year student in CSC AIML, and today we'll be talking about CSS preprocessors. Before talking about CSS preprocessors, I'll let you know about what are preprocessors. So, preprocessors are an application or a program that basically modify your code so that it can be used by another application or a program itself. It's just like modifying a thing so others can also use it. Yeah. So talking about CSS preprocessors, it's basically a scripting language that extends your CSS and it gives you many different features so that it is easier for you to code and add styling to your websites. Yeah. It actually gets compiled into your regular CSS syntax itself. So you don't have to learn anything special for that. It's just your basic CSS but lesser. So what are benefits you get for using CSS preprocessors such as SASS or less? The first being it makes it more flexible for you to code. The second being it reduces the lines of code required and makes your style sheet a bit cleaner and easier to read. The third being shareable. What I mean by shareable is actually the code snippets can be used by multiple classes or elements. So we don't have to write the same code again and again to add the same styling. So in this, it has actually many different features, just like JavaScript, uh, like defining a function or reusing a code again and again, creating new variables, creating partials, etc. So one of the CSS preprocessors we are talking about today is SASS, which stands for syntactically awesome style sheet. Now, SASS actually provides us a compiler that allows us to write CSS in a different way. Yeah. So it's basically an extension of CSS which adds nested rules, variable mixins, which we'll be talking about later, selector inheritance, and no more semicolons and curly braces, obviously. So I'll start with my installation. I'll share my screen. Yeah, is my screen visible?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm currently on my VS Code. I just created a folder, and it has just basic HTML written. To install SASS, we just have to install an extension in VS Code itself, which is named as Live SASS Compiler, and it was created by Glenn Marks. Uh, just installing this extension in your VS Code allows you to write SASS, which basically compiles to your CSS, which we'll be discovering later. So I'll share the link to this later. Share it in the chat. This is the extension. Yeah, only this extension is required for you to use SASS in your project. Now, oh yeah, this type is coming. I've created an HTML file which just has a boilerplate code, nothing else. Now, this style.sass is actually a bit different from a normal CSS. How? As you can see from the naming, it has the file extension of .sass rather than .css. And I told you about SASS stands for syntactically awesome style sheet. In here, from the extension we just installed, we can see two options. First one is what SASS, and second one is what SASS. They are actually two different things, which I'll tell you later. I'll just now the thing is the HTML cannot understand the code or my CSS written in SAS. What it will do is it will compile my SAS code into a normal CSS, which can be used in my HTML file. For example, I'll create a div element and name it. I give it a class SAS div. Now, if I like give it some styling, background color, good, this my pattern. Correct, so that it is visible to us. I also try to link it to my HTML file. So, yeah. As you can see, nothing is visible because my HTML cannot understand the .sass file extension. For that to you know, the same results. Yeah. For that, my HTML to understand my SAS code written, what I have to do is I'll run this extension using watch SAS. I'll click on it and it will show watching. That means it will now monitor my SAS code and it will convert it into normal CSS. As you can see, as soon as I click the button, I got two files in here. The first one is style.css, which is the same file name just with the CSS extension. And the second one is CSS map. This file converts my SAS code into normal CSS. Now, my SAS is actually converted to normal CSS code, as you can see. I didn't write anything. I didn't even add curly braces. I didn't create this file. It was created by SAS itself. Now, since my style.css file is created and I have given the styling for the correct class name, but still I can't see my CSS on the web page because I haven't linked this style sheet to the HTML file. So rather giving style.sass, I'll give it style.css. As you can see, it's visible to you. And I just wrote my code in SAS, not in basic CSS. So that's the difference we have. As you can see, we don't have any semicolon or curly braces, and it's just like Python. Here, indentation is quite important. Yeah, anything can like just mess around with the basic tab. If I like, add it like this, I won't be able to see. It shows me complete different errors. Yeah. So my SAS code is converted into vanilla CSS through the style.map file. Now, I'll talk about CSS variables. Since it's like my CSS with brain, I can create some variables in here. Why do we need to create variables first of all? Because, like, for example, if you are like too much, if you're caring about the color, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'll just choose a color first of all. For example, this color. Here I want my div element to have this background color. And just in case there are many elements who I wish to have the same background color, my header file and my learning SAS. I've used the same hex code for my both of the elements, my header and my div with the class of SAS div. Now, what if I want to change my color? I have to like now here I have example of only two elements, but what if there are like hundred of elements using the same color? I have to change them individually. If I want to change my color, for example, I'll pick another color. I'll use this red brown color. I have to change this I'll be creating CSS variables in there. Now, a syntax for creating a variable is start with a dollar sign, name your variable, I'll name it primary color, and I'll store my value, I'll store the hex code in this variable. Now, whenever I want to use this color, I can use the name of the variable, primary color. You can see nothing has changed, but if I change the hex code in just one area, I just changed it once, and both the changes were reflected. Yeah, so this was about your variables which you just created. Actually, this is quite helpful. Whenever you want to use the same color again and again in multiple areas, you can use these type of variables, and there's no limit. There's no fixed number of how many uh, variables there should be. There can be hundreds or even thousands of them if you are going to use them. Yeah. So this was one of the features that SAS provides us, but it is already there in CSS. We have it in our CSS. You can use that var and then minus the variable color, something like that. But what is it's actually easy to understand. That's the benefit point in here. The syntax is quite simple. I know what I've created. I know what it means. A person who has no knowledge or a bit knowledge in CSS can actually understand this. That we are storing a hex code in a variable and then using it again and again. So it's quite user friendly and easily readable. So this was about your variables. Moving on, we're talking about nesting. Now, what if I have multiple elements inside a div? For example, I'll create a div. I'll name it as button, and I create multiple of them. Buttons. I haven't selected. Now, I'll try that all these buttons get aligned in the center of the screen with some spacing in them, and the buttons themselves should have some styling. What can be done is I'll use my class name first of all to style my div. SASS div with button. I give the background color of conflag blue. I can see that. I'll align. Yeah. Now, normal CSS to style this, what we have to do is we have to write the class name again and then select our button. This was the way which we used in our normal CSS file, but here it's actually easier. Whenever we want to access a child element from a parent element, we can just write it inside the class itself, just like a button. I want my button to have a background color, primary, let's say primary color. I'll give them some padding and also pixels. As you can see, I just gave my CSS styling to one of the buttons, and it was passed on to each and every button. That is the normal CSS, nothing special in that. But as you can see, I didn't have to mention the class name before the button element to actually select it. This indentation is actually quite important. It specifies that any button present inside my SASS div button class, I have to apply this styling to it. Yeah, it's similar to if I talk about similar to dot SAS div button. Similar to this and normal CSS. So this was about your nesting. Yeah, now if I want to apply hover state features, how would I do that? I can have my nested styling in a nested element itself. If I want to add hover state styling in all my buttons, I can use that ampersand hover. And then it makes sense. Makes sense. I'll change the banner color to and you can see all of these buttons are having the same styling. It's actually easier to add your code using SAS for hover, for your focus, even content before and after. I can have like ampersand symbol, double semicolon after. Could use my content property. Like, so it will be seen everybody here. So after the name, I can see the content which I've just added. So this was about your nesting. The third and like the most important feature about SAS is partials. Now, what are partials? Partials is actually dividing your style sheet into different components so that my main style sheet is cleaner and it's easier for multiple people to code in a group project. Now, as you can see, it's a bit longer piece of code. I can divide it into a separate file known as partials. So we'll create a separate file. Now, there's a special thing about this. The new file will be starting with underscore. What this underscore is actually important because it tells SAS that it is a small segment of the code and it will not convert my SAS to the CSS. I'll name it as SAS dev button dot SAS. I'll just cut paste my code in this file. If I show you, I haven't included this styling. The CSS styling which I added, it has been removed because I haven't linked the both files together. And because of this underscore, I can't use this SAS file in my, it won't generate a separate CSS file and it won't be used by my HTML file. For this to include in my main SAS folder, the method is use ampersand @ symbol import again. What's that? SAS dev SAS dev button. Sorry, just a minute. I have to import it here in the main file. Import SAS dev button. Now, this code which applies this styling is present in a completely different file, and I've imported the file to my main style.sas file, which creates another style.css linked to my index.html and which is rendered. Now, whatever code I write in .sas file, It is converted into normal CSS file by the compiler provided by SAS. As you can see, if the speciality is noticed when you use Flex for the property which are varying in different browsers or different laptops, it's quite easier for you to use SAS in that scenario. So that is about your partials. The next important feature is mixins. What are mixins actually? For that mixins, I'll show you some code repetition features that I created with the class div two inside div two. What if I want my div 2 and div SAS div button to be aligned in the center of the screen? For that, I have to target them both first of all. I'll keep it display fix. I'll specify this. As you can see, all these buttons are aligned in the center of the screen, but nothing has happened to my div 2. So I have to add the styling. And add name section dot div 2 div x. I continue. Now, for both the divs to align their respective contents in the center, I had to write the same piece of code again and again here and in this SAS div button file. Now, this problem can be solved by using mixins. Now, what are mixins? Mixins is a group of CSS declarations that can be reused throughout the style sheet. What I mean by that, I have to write the same code once. I can use it again and again. The syntax is symbol mixins. We call this method. We'll name our mixin. Since we are using flex, which aligns our content center, I'll name it as flex center. I'll just copy this content. I'll also add some background. Now, to apply this styling, similar styling in number one, my div 2, secondly, my SAS div button, I have to just include the styling in it. The method is using @include and the name of my mixin, which is flex. The styling has been applied to my div 2 div 2. I'll do the same for since. Indeed, both the styling have been applied on both the tags, both the div elements. I have just written the code once. Now, what if both the div elements has to have a basic styling similar and the rest they differ as you code? For example, I want my buttons to be in a single line, but the text inside div2 should be aligned vertically. For that, Mixins has a solution itself. We can provide parameters inside Mixins. For example, I'll provide my flex direction through Mixins. I'll create a variable inside Mixins and I'll pass it to that. I'm passing this variable as an argument, which will be used by one of the styling inside Mixins. Flex direction, and I'll give the value of direction variable. Okay. I want my div2 to be aligned vertically. For that, my flex direction should have the value of column. So I can pass it using column. Okay. I can pass it using row. As you can see, the buttons are aligned horizontally and the text is aligned vertically, but both of them has the same base CSS, which was made easy by Mixins. Yeah. Not even one, but multiple parameters could be passed. Now I'll try to change the background color. For example, I'll pass the value. I'll pass another argument named BG color. The background color as BG color. I want my div2 to have a background color of light green. And it should have the background color of light blue. You can see multiple arguments could be passed inside my mixins, which will apply the style with the respective components. So this was about your mixins, which were a group of CSS declarations, which we just declared once and used multiply, just as functions in JavaScript. The syntax is a bit complicated for you to understand at once, but as you practice it, it becomes easier. So now let's talk about another feature of SASS named as extend. Now, what's the need of using extend? Just imagine a scenario if you want to use two elements, if you want to style two elements in a similar way. The first method could be copying the CSS and pasting into another element selector and further making some necessary changes, just as we did here. More necessary changes. But all this doesn't make any sense because we are using SASS for avoiding code repetition. For that, another method can be using extend property. Extend property. I'll just create more. Remove this styling of div2, should be just normal, back to normal. Now, let me first style my text inside div2 tag, and then I'll copy the same code without copying the whole code. I'll just show you. Dot div2 will be having text decoration of the line. Font weight could be increased as 600. Lines and example. Now, I want the similar styling inside my SASS extended, but the text should be aligned the way it is right now. What I can do is I'll use the extend property as I told you. We'll use this class to call uh, target the dev element, which is SASS extend, and including the extend property. All I have to do is I have to name my selector which I used previously, which was .diff2. Now, as you can see, the similar styling has been applied, but to differentiate both of them, I'll change some styling. It's both of them have similar styling, but one of the diff is aligned in the left and one in the center. And I just wrote code for one, and I extended the same code in another div tag. One of the features, it's similar to mixin. We can create a function like this passing several arguments, but if you want to style your elements individually and then copying the styling, this extend feature is actually advisable. So this is about your extend feature. Now, since I told you it's like JavaScript for your CSS, we can also use conditional statements in SASS. Now, what do I mean by conditional statements? I'll create some buttons. Name and give the class of danger. So inside this div, I've created 3 buttons, each of them with different classes. I'll create a styling for them using mixins itself, so as to avoid repetition. I will return as mixin. I'll provide the class name as an argument, so that each button with different classes could be styled differently. What I meant by conditional statement is we could use if or else if, just like we used conditional statements in our programming languages to manage our code properly. To write it here. The syntax is if, and the value of variable has to be targeted, which is class name. If my class name is danger, I want the background color should be red. Else if my class name is information, so the background color should be blue. And for anything else, the background color can be yellow or green. So here I'll talk about the syntax. If starts, it will like first search for the class name. If it matches with danger, it applies the specified styling. Else if it will move forward and check for other classes, other variable, and for whichever it matches, it will apply the styling. So use it and use now I can include the mixin here using @include. I'll pass the class name as danger. And this styling has to be applied for the button which has the class as danger. Differentiate them using padding itself. Button which depicts danger should have padding. Folder. This of can have my button with the class of danger. You can see the styling has been applied. Depending upon the class name which I provide, it matches with whichever variable, whichever class it has to be, and the respective CSS is applied. For the rest of them, up to information. Okay. Pass my class name into the same function, and I get 3 different style buttons. Class name for data. Background color should be green. Padding has been applied. I'll use my variable primary color. Depending on my class name, the styling is varying, and I just have to include the mixing, and depending on that, the styling is applied. So this was about your basics of SAS. We spoke about, starting from the beginning, we spoke about CSS variables, which you just created for a color, which could be multiple variables could be used. Next, we spoke about nesting. As here, we use some in this one. Next, we spoke about partials, which are creating separate files for your styling, and the naming has to be taken care of. They have to start with an underscore so that your SAS knows that it's not your primary SAS file. It's just a different component which is finally included in your main file using import. It's finally imported. Next, we talked about mixins, creating a basic template for your CSS and then varying according to the arguments provided, just like JS functions. Next, we spoke about extend, in which we had an element styled by itself and then use the similar styling in another component and then making necessary changes if required. And last but not the least, we spoke about conditional statements in SAS. Depending on the argument passed to the mixin, we could have different styling which could be provided.